Las Vegas, spring of 1978. The Mint Casino on Fremont Street is humming with smoke, cocktail glasses, the clack of chips against felt. At a roulette table near the back wall, a young woman in a flowered dress is placing her bets late, strangely late, almost defiantly late, just as the croupier waves his hand to close the action. She looks calm. She wins. Then she wins again. And then, in the middle of the next spin, something inside her shoe begins to burn. She does not flinch. She does not look up. But under the table, beneath layers of insulation and tape and a tiny custom-built circuit board, a metal pin is heating against the soft flesh of her foot. Smoke is curling, faintly, from inside the leather. She bites the inside of her cheek and walks away from the table without collecting all of her chips. Outside, in a cheap rented car parked 2 blocks from the Strip, a man in his late 20s with long hair and wire-rimmed glasses is staring at a small handheld display. He is a doctoral student in physics. So is the man next to him. So is the woman who just walked off the casino floor with a hole burning into her foot. They are not professional gamblers. They are not con artists. They are not connected to organized crime. They are graduate students from the University of California at Santa Cruz. And they have just become, on a single quiet Tuesday in May, the first people in human history to beat the wheel of roulette using a computer hidden inside a shoe. This is the story of a small group of physicists and dreamers who called themselves the Eudaemons, from the Greek word for happiness, and how, over the course of 3 years, they built a machine that should have made them millions. It is the story of a wager between madness and mathematics. And it begins, like most strange stories, in a yellow house on Riverside Avenue, in a quiet town on the California coast, with 3 friends, a chalkboard, and a single ridiculous question. Could a small enough computer, attached to a human body, predict where a roulette ball would land before it landed? His name was Doyne Farmer. People who knew him in the 70s described him the same way every time. Tall, skinny, talkative, hair to his shoulders, eyes that did not quite settle on you when he spoke, because part of his attention was always somewhere else, working on a problem only he could see. He had grown up in Silver City, New Mexico, the son of an engineer, raised among rocks and stars and physics textbooks. By the age of 19, he was studying at Stanford. By 23, he was at the University of California at Santa Cruz, pursuing a doctorate in physics, specifically in a strange new field with no department, no funding, and almost no name. They were calling it chaos theory. At Santa Cruz, he had found a partner in another graduate student, Norman Packard. Where Doyne was loud and charismatic, Norman was quiet and rigorous. They had known each other since they were teenagers in New Mexico. Norman's mind was the kind that moved in straight lines. Doyne's moved sideways. Together they made a single brain, the way certain brothers do, the way certain old friends with parallel obsessions sometimes do. The 2 of them lived, along with a rotating cast of friends and lovers, in a sprawling Victorian house at 707 Riverside Avenue. The house was a kind of intellectual commune, a blackboard in the kitchen, equations chalked on the bathroom door, stacks of books by R.D. Laing and Buckminster Fuller and Edward Thorpe. They cooked meals together. They argued about determinism. They smoked in the living room and debated deep into the night whether the universe was a clockwork machine or a spinning coin. In the spring of 1977, Doyne went to a friend's birthday party in the hills above Santa Cruz. There was a cake, there was wine, and in the corner of the living room, there was a small wooden roulette wheel set up on a card table, half a joke, half a curiosity. He stood next to it for a long time. He watched the ball spin, he watched it bounce, he watched it settle into one slot and then another. And he thought, this is not random. Nothing in physics is truly random. A roulette ball is a marble thrown along a tilted, decelerating track. Its motion is governed by Newton's laws, air resistance, friction, gravity. The rotational deceleration of the wheel itself, all of it could, in principle, be calculated. All of it could be predicted. He was 24 years old. He had no money. He had no equipment. He had no plan. But by the time he left the party that evening, he was already drafting the equations in his head. He drove home and burst into the kitchen at 707 Riverside and told Norman what he had been thinking. Norman listened, leaning against the counter, holding a cup of cold coffee. He did not say it was crazy. He did not say it was impossible. He said only one sentence. We would need a computer small enough to wear. The idea was not entirely new. Doyne knew that. In the early 1960s, two men named Edward Thorpe and Claude Shannon, one of them the inventor of information theory itself, had built what they called the world's first wearable computer. It was the size of a pack of cigarettes. It clipped to a belt. It used toe switches and an earpiece. They had taken it into a Las Vegas casino in 1961 and won small amounts of money before the wires broke and the whole project quietly died. Shannon went back to MIT. Thorpe moved on to blackjack and eventually the stock market. The idea was buried in a footnote. Doyne and Norman dug it back up. By the summer of 1977, they had recruited a third partner, a graduate student in mathematics named Letty Boleyn, and a fourth, an electronics enthusiast named Steve Lawton. The four of them committed secretly and seriously to a single goal. They would build a computer small enough to fit inside a shoe. They would teach that computer the physics of roulette. And they would take it to Las Vegas and break the bank. They called themselves the Eudaemons. They began in the basement. They bought a used roulette wheel from a casino supply company in Reno for $1,500 and bolted it to a workbench. They lit it from above with fluorescent tubes. They aimed a Super 8 movie camera at it. They ran the wheel for hours, spinning the ball, filming each rotation, slowing the footage frame by frame, measuring the ball's deceleration, the wheel's friction, the precise angle at which the ball typically left the upper rim and crashed into the metal frets of the rotor. They learned that the rotor decelerated at a predictable rate, losing about 1 revolution every 10 seconds. They learned that the ball, once released, took on average 18 revolutions before falling. They learned that they did not need to predict the exact slot the ball would land in. They needed only to predict the half of the wheel, what they called the octant, where it was most likely to settle. Even a slight bias toward the correct octant would, over thousands of spins, produce a mathematical edge of around 44% in their favor. In casino terms, that was not an edge. That was a massacre. There was only one problem. They had to do it in real time, while standing at the table, while a stranger spun the ball, while cocktail waitresses circled and pit bosses watched, with no notebook, no calculator, no visible motion of any kind. The math had to live inside their bodies. So they built a computer. It was the size of a pack of cigarettes. The processor was a small chip called the 6502, the same chip that powered the first home computers of that era. They wrote the operating code by hand, line by line, in raw machine language, on a teletype machine in the back room of the physics department. They mounted the entire device on a thin sheet of fiberglass. They wrapped it in foam. They wired it to a small battery. They sewed it into the bottom of a hollowed-out leather shoe. The operator, the person standing at the table, wore the input shoe. Inside the toe of that shoe was a small switch. The operator would tap with the big toe 4 times. First, when the ball was released. Second, when the ball passed a fixed reference point on its first revolution. This gave the computer the ball's velocity. Third, when a marked slot on the rotor passed under the ball. This gave the computer the rotor's velocity and current position. From those 3 taps, the computer would solve the equations of motion in roughly 2/3 of a second and predict, with reasonable accuracy, where the ball would fall. The prediction was then transmitted by an inductive loop to a second shoe, worn by a second player standing somewhere else at the table. That second shoe contained a ring of small electromagnetic plungers, solenoids, pressed against the bottom of the wearer's foot. The solenoids would buzz in a coded pattern, telling the bettor which octant of the wheel to bet. It was a thing of strange and beautiful insanity. It worked. In their basement, on a bolted-down wheel, it worked. The next step was Las Vegas. The first trip was a disaster. In December of 1977, Doyne, Norman, and Letty drove from Santa Cruz to Las Vegas in a borrowed station wagon, with the computer carefully padded inside a suitcase. They had $3,000 in pooled savings, most of it Doyne's, scraped together from a graduate stipend, and a single roulette shoe each. The plan was simple. They would test the system in a real casino, win modestly, and come home. They walked onto the floor at 10 in the evening. Doyne wore the data-taking shoe. Letty wore the betting shoe. Norman stood at a slot machine across the room, watching for security, his pocket full of nickels he was not actually playing. The wheel began to spin. Doyne tapped his toe. The computer hummed. Letty waited for the buzz against her foot. Nothing happened. She placed a small bet at random. The ball landed on 23. She lost. Another spin. Doyne tapped. Still nothing. Another spin. Nothing. After 15 minutes, Letty walked away from the table and met Norman in the lobby. They opened the suitcase in their motel room and discovered that one of the wires connecting the input shoe to the main board had snapped during the long drive across the desert. They drove home the next morning, repaired the wire, and resolved to come back. They came back. Again and again and again. Across the next 2 years, the Eudaemons made roughly a dozen trips to Las Vegas and Reno. Each trip was a fresh ordeal. The hardware was, in their own later words, a nightmare. The solenoids overheated and burned the skin of the bettor's foot. The wires broke in transit and had to be resoldered in casino bathrooms. A capacitor would short and send a sudden electric jolt up the operator's leg in the middle of a spin, and the operator would have to pretend to cough so as not to scream. On one occasion, a tiny pin inside Letty's shoe drove itself into her foot during a particularly long session and drew blood through the leather. She finished the night, walked back to the motel, and bandaged her foot in silence. But when the machine worked, it really worked. They tracked their winnings in a small notebook. In April of 1978, on a single weekend in Reno, they won $800. By summer, the cumulative total was $3,500. By the end of that year, more than $10,000. They were not rich, but they were proving, in the only laboratory that mattered, that the physics worked. Word began to spread inside the house at Riverside Avenue. New members joined the project, a graduate student in physics named Jim Crutchfield, an engineer named Mark Truitt, a young woman named Lorna Lyons, fearless at the table, calmer under a pit boss's stare than anyone the team had ever recruited. Each new member added something, a refinement to the code, a smaller battery, a more reliable solenoid array. The computer shrank. The predictions sharpened. They also moved the project deeper underground. They were aware by this point that what they were doing existed in a strange legal gray zone. Counting cards in blackjack, while frowned upon, was legal. The Nevada State Gaming Control Board had recently begun discussing what they called electronic devices. There was no law yet against using a computer to beat roulette. But there did not need to be. The casinos enforced their own laws. If they caught you, they did not call the police. They walked you into a back room. And what happened in that back room depended very much on the mood of the man you met there. The Eudaemons knew the stories. They had read the same books as everyone else who studied this world. They knew what had happened to certain card counters in the years before. They knew that the word backroomed was not a metaphor. So they invented a system to protect themselves. Multiple players, different casinos, different times of day. Short sessions, modest bets. Never the same wheel 2 nights in a row. Never the same hotel. They moved through the strip like ghosts. They wore wigs. They changed accents. They spoke in code on the casino floor. The buzz pattern from the solenoid was translated into hand signals, eye movements, the placement of a glass on a coaster. By the spring of 1979, they had refined the system further. They had built a second-generation computer, smaller and more reliable. They had recruited new players to widen the rotation. They calculated their theoretical edge against a properly tilted wheel at 44%. Over time, with enough spins, that edge would translate into millions. And then, briefly, beautifully, it began to. A weekend at Caesars, plus $4,000. A weekend at the Hilton, plus $6,000. A weekend in Reno, 3 players moving between 2 wheels in 2 different casinos, plus another $5,000. By the late summer of 1979, the Eudaemons had won, by their own internal accounting, somewhere between $30,000 and $40,000 in cumulative gross winnings. Not yet a fortune, but proof. Proof that their system, against the most refined gambling machine ever invented, was profitable. Proof that the roulette wheel, the supposed symbol of pure chance, was in fact a deterministic system that could be cracked by physics. They began to talk seriously about scaling up, about a 3rd-generation computer, about teams of operators working multiple casinos simultaneously, about millions, real millions, money that could fund a research institute, a chaos theory lab, a permanent home for the kind of strange science nobody else would pay for. In the kitchen at 707 Riverside, they drew the next phase on the chalkboard. Operators in Las Vegas, operators in Atlantic City, operators in Monte Carlo. A central hub in Santa Cruz, processing data, training new players, refining the algorithm. A small, secret company, the Eudaemonic Corporation. For a few months in that kitchen, the future looked enormous. And then, in the middle of 1979, the hardware began to fail in a different way. Not the wires, not the solenoids, the people. The computer worked, the math was sound. But the toll of operating the system, standing at a roulette table, tapping precisely, hiding electronics on your body, fearing the back room, switching identities every weekend, was wearing down the team. Letty was the first to step back. The pin in her foot had left a small white scar, the size of a grain of rice, that she would carry for the rest of her life. She had nightmares about pit bosses. She told Doyne one evening on the porch at Riverside that she could not do another trip. He nodded. He understood. He did not argue. Then Steve Lawton left, citing a graduate thesis he had been ignoring for 2 years. Then Jim Crutchfield reduced his role. The active operating team, which had at one point numbered 8, was down to 4. Norman, who had always been more cautious than Doyne, began voicing the question they had all avoided. What if they got caught? Not by the casinos, by the federal government, by the IRS, who had noticed large unexplained cash deposits, by the state of Nevada, which was beginning, very quietly, to draft new legislation about electronic devices in casinos. What if all of this, the basement, the equations, the years of work, ended not in triumph, but in a courtroom in Las Vegas with an underpaid public defender? Doyne listened. Doyne did not stop. They returned to the Strip in October of 1979, with 2 new operators and a new generation of the computer, the smallest yet. The first night was successful. They won $1,200 in 2 hours. The second night, the new computer overheated against the operator's body inside the casino, and a thin curl of smoke began rising, faintly but unmistakably, from the seam of his shoe. He looked down. He looked up. He walked, slowly, with the controlled gait of a man who was on fire, toward the men's room. He locked himself in a stall. He pulled off the shoe. He buried it in his backpack, smothered it with a wet towel, and waited for his hands to stop shaking. That was the end of the second-generation computer. And, although none of them knew it yet, it was the beginning of the end of the Eudaemons. There was no single dramatic ending, no raid, no arrest, no back room. The Eudaemons were never caught, never identified, never named in any casino's blacklist. The collapse, when it came, was internal. The hardware problems, which had been an inconvenience, became a wall. The third-generation computer they had been designing required components that were either too expensive or did not yet exist. The miniaturization needed was, in the late 1970s, just barely past the edge of what was technically possible. Every new prototype solved one problem and introduced 2 more. Solenoids burned out, batteries leaked, wires snapped at the most delicate solder points. The team began to suspect privately that the eudaemonic pie, their nickname for the project, would never be fully cooked. And the academic world was waiting for them. Doyne and Norman had dissertations to finish, real ones, about chaos theory and dynamical systems and the strange deterministic behavior of complex systems, including, ironically, the kind of physics they had been doing in casinos for years. Their advisors were patient, but not infinitely patient. Funding committees were beginning to notice that 2 of the most promising young physicists in the country had been spending an awful lot of time in Las Vegas. In 1981, 4 years after the birthday party with the wooden roulette wheel, Doyne Farmer formally suspended the casino operations. The shoes were placed in a cardboard box. The chalkboard in the kitchen was wiped clean. The Eudaemonic Corporation was never incorporated. The dream of teams of operators in Monte Carlo was set aside, gently, like a plate left on a high shelf. The exact total of their winnings has never been confirmed. By the most reliable estimates, drawn later from the participants themselves, the Eudaemons cleared somewhere between $10,000 and $15,000 in net profit across the entire run, after expenses, after travel, after the cost of components and broken prototypes. Adjusted for inflation, it was real money. But against the years of labor, the basement, the burns, the broken wires, the sleepless drives across the Mojave, it was not the fortune they had imagined. They had won, but they had not won big. For a few years, the story stayed inside the house at Riverside. The ex-Eudaemons scattered into legitimate careers. Doyne completed his doctorate and took a position at Los Alamos National Laboratory, working on chaos theory and complex systems. Norman went to the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. Letty Boleyn became a lawyer and a public servant. Jim Crutchfield became one of the leading figures in the field of computational mechanics. The shoes gathered dust in a closet. Then in 1985, a journalist named Thomas Bass, who had been an undergraduate in their orbit at Santa Cruz, published a book called The Eudaemonic Pie. It told the whole story: the basement, the shoes, the burned feet, the cigarette pack computer, the casino runs. The book did not make them rich, but it made them, in a quiet way, legendary among the people who paid attention to such things. And here's where the story turns, in a way no one quite expected. The Eudaemons had built a machine to beat roulette. They had not, in the strictest sense, succeeded. But the skills they had developed, predicting the behavior of a complex, deterministic system in real time, with imperfect data, under pressure, were the same skills that, a decade later, would turn out to be enormously valuable somewhere very far from Las Vegas. In 1991, Doyne Farmer and Norman Packard, along with several other ex-Eudaemons, founded a small company in Santa Fe, New Mexico. They called it the Prediction Company. Its purpose was simple: to use the same mathematical techniques they had developed in a Santa Cruz basement applied not to roulette wheels, but to the global financial markets. The Prediction Company was, by every available account, extraordinarily successful. In 1995, the Swiss banking giant UBS purchased a stake in it. The exact figures were never publicly disclosed, but the company was reportedly profitable from almost its first year of operation and remained so for more than a decade after. Doyne Farmer and Norman Packard, the two graduate students who had once driven a borrowed station wagon to Las Vegas with $3,000 and a homemade computer in a suitcase, became wealthy men. Not gambling wealthy, quant wealthy. The kind of wealth that pays for research institutes and tenured chairs. In the years that followed, both men returned to academia. Doyne became a professor at Oxford and one of the founding voices in the field of complexity economics. Norman became a leading researcher in evolvable hardware and complexity theory. Letty Boleyn worked, for a time, on environmental policy in 2 presidential administrations. Jim Crutchfield ran one of the most important research labs in computational mechanics in the United States. The shoes themselves, the original cigarette pack computers, the burned solenoids and the snapped wires, most of the surviving artifacts were eventually given to a German computer museum, where one of the original eudaemonic shoes is on display, behind glass, alongside the early relics of personal computing. It is a strange exhibit. A leather shoe with a small hole cut into the sole, a tangle of wire, a small, brave little circuit board. There is a sentence Doyne Farmer used years later when asked whether he regretted the casino years. He said, "We did not get rich beating roulette. We got rich learning how to think about prediction." The lesson of the eudaemonic pie, in the end, was not the lesson the Eudaemons set out to teach. They had wanted to prove that a roulette wheel was not random. They had proven something larger. That a small group of people, working together in a kitchen, with a chalkboard and a stolen wheel and a homemade computer in a shoe, could sometimes see further into the future than the most powerful institutions in the world. The casinos never noticed. The casinos still do not know. Somewhere on the Las Vegas Strip tonight, a roulette ball is spinning, and a small group of physicists, half a century ago, in a basement in California, were the first humans on Earth to know exactly where it was going to land.